Okay, here is the long-awaited global climate change note. So let's go ahead and get started. So climate change has occurred throughout Earth's history. We have various methods to kind of infer how the climate was, average temperatures, etc., in the past. And as we have explored the deep past, we found that there have been periods of time where the temperatures were warmer than they are currently, and periods of time where the temperatures were colder than they are currently. So here is a graph showing kind of an approximation of, now this is CO2 concentrations, but as we've talked about in our previous lessons, there is a very close relationship between CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere and the average temperature. So from this and the CO2 concentrations, we can infer that, okay, this period of time between looks like about 425 million years ago and 350 million years ago was warmer than today. Then this period of time from about 350 million years ago to maybe 275, 280 million years ago, this was cooler than today. And we can kind of infer these historic climate trends for hundreds of millions of years ago. In some cases, maybe even a few billion years ago, though it becomes a little harder to do as you go farther back in time. So there are recorded ice ages throughout history. These are periods of lower average global temperatures where we tend to have glaciers and ice sheets in polar regions. We're currently in an ice age, but we're in something called an interglacial period where we don't have, for example, the entire northern hemisphere or most of the northern hemisphere covered in giant ice sheets. So temperatures are a little warmer than during the peak of an ice age. Then there are warm periods. Sometimes these are called greenhouse Earth periods, where there are high enough average temperatures that there isn't polar ice, there aren't polar ice sheets. And that's existed at multiple times throughout history as well. How do we know what past climate data was like? Well, especially for the past few 100,000 years and few million years, we can use things like ice cores. These are cylinders of ice that you drill out from either an ice sheet or a glacier. What happens is ice and snow fall in these areas and it doesn't melt because the temperatures stay cold enough for the ice to remain ice. And snow, when it falls, ends up getting compacted by other layers of snow falling on top, and bubbles of air from that period of time when the snow is falling get trapped. And then, if you analyze those bubbles of air, you can draw conclusions about what the climate conditions were when that ice and snow, that snow became compacted into ice. So when you look at Greenland, Greenland has kind of the biggest ice sheet here in the northern hemisphere, and it contains climate data for the past about 123,000 years. If you go to Antarctica, some of those ice sheets are deep enough that and old enough that you can get climate data for the past 800,000 years. You can also look at sediment cores. These are usually extracted from the ocean floor, so sediment falls, traps fossil or the remains of organisms that will eventually become fossils and other things. And some of those areas can contain climate data as far back as 5 million years ago. A lot of the climate data is inferred from looking at microscopic organisms that have fossilized and looking at relative concentrations of them, maybe even some chemical conditions of their shells can tell you about historic temperatures in the past. So feel free to pause on this slide and read all the information. This is a very good collection of information about how we have used ice cores to collect a lot of climate data. So here we're just going to kind of go through it very briefly. There have been multiple sites in Antarctica and in Greenland where ice cores have been removed. This shows you on the bottom left how they remove these ice cores, but this image right here is showing you an actual kind of fuzzy looking ice core. The layers that you see, notice they're alternating layers of dark and light. That actually is a result of the season when this falls. So summer layers tend to be lighter than winter layers, so you can even see seasonal differences. This information in the middle is kind of talking about how you can get some of the information. So it talks about isotopes of oxygen. Isotopes are atoms that have different numbers of neutrons. We talked a little bit about this when we talked about nuclear power. We're not going to go into detail on this, and I'm not even going to talk about it because of the fact that it's not covered on the AP test. But that's kind of how they figure out some of the climate data. They look at oxygen isotopes. Then also they can get CO2 concentrations. And from those CO2 concentrations, since like I said, there's a very high correlation between CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere and the average global temperature, that they can kind of make that climate record. And then you can also see sometimes, especially in recent years, when we have recordings of when certain volcanoes erupted, you can actually see evidence of that in ash layers in the ice core. So it helps us kind of look at timing. You can also see things like the first nuclear material from when we first started testing nuclear bombs on the surface, lead concentration from when we started using leaded gasoline, all sorts of information that you can get from there. So if there's a natural climate change, what is the difference between that and anthropogenic climate change? And if you have somehow forgotten what it means, anthropogenic means it's caused by humans. You can say it's man-made if you want, though, both genders are doing it. Um, so natural climate change takes a long time. Even when it's relatively rapid, it usually takes millions or tens of millions of years. Geologic time is much slower than the type of time scale we think of. We think of things in terms of years, maybe decades, maybe a few centuries. Geologic time is millions of years or tens of millions of years. And that's the scale on which natural climate change usually happens. Anthropogenic climate change is happening, though, over the course of a couple of centuries. It has not actually been that long since the Industrial Revolution, compared to, say, the millions of years that we have some climate record for. And over a relatively short period of time, the climate is changing fairly rapidly for the Earth. The difference is that while both of these things can cause large scale species extinctions, cause shifts in climate patterns and precipitation and temperature, the slower the climate change happens, the more time species have to attempt to adapt or evolve in response to these changes. But anthropogenic climate change is happening so quickly that it is really making it much harder for species to survive. Since they can't adapt fast enough, they end up going extinct instead. And that's a really big concern. So let's talk about some of the impacts of anthropogenic climate change. This is not by any means an exhaustive list. There are other impacts that I didn't have the time to put in here, and also that aren't listed on your course and exam description. But some general effects: rising temperatures, increased drought in some areas, increased flooding in other areas, both sea ice, ice sheets, glaciers, and permafrost is melting, more intense storms, especially hurricanes, increased incidence of wildfires. Some areas have seasonal wildfires, and that wildfire season is getting longer. Rising sea levels are also an issue. Because of those rising sea levels, coastal populations of both animals and humans will be displaced. Obviously, plant species won't be able to migrate in response to rising sea levels, so uh, we'll talk about that effect in a little bit. Loss of species diversity if these coastal populations of species get wiped out. And let's look at the particular effects of sea level rise on marine ecosystems. So, there can actually be some positive effects. One positive effect is if you have sea levels rising, that's going to flood a new area of shallow water, and that could create additional habitats for some organisms. A negative impact, though, is that deeper communities may no longer be in the photic zone. For both of these two things, we're going to look at their effects on another slide. Here, let's look at what happens to some slow growing species. So, you might have salt marshes or mangroves on the coastline. When the sea level rises, as you're seeing in this bottom diagram, now areas that were kind of shallow or maybe intertidal, only partially covered by water, are now totally underwater, completely underwater, and they are no longer good habitats for, say, mangrove trees. Well, here's the thing: Plants cannot migrate by getting up and walking somewhere, obviously. But what they can do is they can release their seeds or produce seedlings, and they'll release those in all directions. Whatever area is a good habitat for them, they'll plant, they will grow, and then if they have enough time, you can see a gradual shift in the area where you see these mangroves living. However, trees especially take a longer time to grow to maturity to be able to produce seeds. So, this kind of change will take a long time. If the sea level rise is too rapid, these mangroves may die out before their offspring can start inhabiting new areas. This is also true for species like coral, which once they reach maturity are planted in place. Coral does not move once it's an adult, only their offspring move when they're immature. And so if the sea levels rise and they're no longer in the photic zone, that can have a big impact. So let's talk about the photic zone. If you don't remember when we talked about aquatic ecosystems, it is the range of water where light penetrates. So there is still light available for photosynthesis. That means that any producers have to live in the photic zone or else they will die. Now, as light travels through water, it gets absorbed. And so you have the photic zone. And then below that, you have the aphotic zone where you don't have light penetrate. And notice in this diagram, we have sea plants growing only in the photic zone. Also, notice that you have this kind of gradual sloping of the land underneath the ocean surface. And this is the continental shelf. It is relatively sorry, spelling. The continental shelf, which is relatively shallow, so that's where, species that live in shallow water can live. And then you have this sharp drop off. Now, when you have lower sea levels, more of that continental shelf is exposed to as dry land. And as you have higher sea levels, for instance, more of that continental shelf is underwater, making more habitat for marine organisms. So, what you'll notice is with this rise in sea levels, so this is rising sea levels. I'm showing you the former sea level. And notice the photic zone has the same thickness because the water is absorbing light at the same rate. But now these sea plants that used to be in the photic zone are no longer in the photic zone, so they're going to die. However, that's a negative consequence. However, notice these sea stars now have an expanded range. So their range was only as high as the maximum sea level. Once the sea level rose, there was an expanded range for these sea stars, so they get more habitat. That could be a positive impact of rising sea level. Now, let's talk about a few other consequences of climate change. So, the atmosphere has these specific circulation patterns we talked about. We talked about, for example, Hadley cells, which are equatorial or tropical circulation. We talked about polar cells, which are going to be um, moving moving air around in the polar region, and then there's an in-between region called the Ferrel cell. These circulation cells, they transport heat from the equator towards the poles. And that's also why, there's kind of not as extreme of a temperature difference between the equator and the poles as there would be without this heat transfer. However, if climate change alters these circulation patterns, that could cause some changes. So, what scientists have noticed is they've been recording kind of the upper edge of the Hadley circulation and noticed it's shifting towards the poles. That's what you see when you see this expanded kind of red area. That's expanded Hadley cell circulation. What this does is this also shifts at the northern edge of the Hadley cell. You have this kind of subtropical dry zone, which usually contains deserts. That area is now shifting northward in the north hemisphere and southward in the southern hemisphere, which means you could have regions that are not accustomed to a desert climate now experiencing a more desert like arid climate, which means that would affect the plants living in the area and the animals living in the area. Also, at the edge of the Hadley cells, you'll have these patterns of movement called the jet streams. You'll hear about it if you ever watch the weather regularly. They'll talk about the jet streams moving across, for example, the United States from west to east. And these are also moving towards the poles. So that's also going to change weather patterns as well. Then, another system that also recirculates heat is the ocean conveyor belt, aka oceanic currents. They carry heat from the equator to the poles as well. There's this global circulation of water that goes throughout all of the oceans, so from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. And this global circulation is very important for heat transfer. How it works is very similar to how air circulation happens, except there's a little bit more of a an effect of salinity. So when water is very salty, it tends to be denser. Cold water or salty water or high salinity water is denser and will tend to sink. Warm water or low salinity water is less dense and will tend to rise. And there are these characteristic areas where you'll see, for example, here up in the North Atlantic, you'll see that there's an area where warm water is going to sink and become a cold water current that's going to carry cold water back towards the south part of the Atlantic to go through the around Antarctica, the Antarctic Circle. Some of it's going to come up in the Indian Ocean, and you're going to see here there's an upwelling. If you remember when we talked about aquatic ecosystems and when we talked about El Nino and La Nina, we talked about the significance of upwellings. And that's where cold water is going to rise, bringing nutrients with it, and is going to be warmed up. Unfortunately, as climate changes and as the Arctic sea ice as well as ice sheets covering Greenland melt, that's going to add fresh water, which could lower the salinity, which could change this ocean circulation. If these currents change, that will have a large impact on global climate, especially in coastal regions. And we're going to talk in more detail about that on the next slide. But one of the big impacts could be the monsoon or tropical rains that happen in certain parts of the world could get disrupted. I know, for instance, India has seasonal monsoons, and these bring a majority of the rain that is going to fall in any given year to many regions of India. Other than that, the only water source they have is melting water coming down through rivers in the Himalayas. And, that gets diverted for dams or it gets polluted. So these monsoons are essential for agriculture. And if they get disrupted, that could cause large scale starvation. There's a particular current that also has a huge impact, and it's fairly relevant to us here in the United States as well, and that is the Atlantic Meridional Ocean Circulation, or AMOC. It transports heat from the equator towards the North Atlantic. And so here you see this North Atlantic current, which is part of the AMOC. See, it moves up past the coast of the United Kingdom and Ireland, past kind of Norway, up past Iceland as well as past Greenland. And then there the water will sink and then it will come down in the ocean circulation. However, if climate change and increased global temperatures cause either an increase in rainfall in certain areas or melt glaciers and sea ice, that could cause a lot of warm, fresh water to enter the ocean in here in this area. That would do two things: it would block the formation of sea ice, and it would also disrupt the sinking of the cold, salty water. That could slow down the current or even stop it completely. There is historical evidence that there were times in the past where warming events would cause the AMOC to slow down or even stop completely, and that had dramatic impacts on Europe. Northwestern Europe, if the AMOC slowed down or completely stopped, would have not only more storms, but would have severely cold winters. That means the average temperature would cool between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius, which is quite a bit. It could render parts of Northern Europe uninhabitable or very difficult to inhabit, which could have a large impact on the population. And another thing that happens is this North Atlantic current is strong enough that it actually um, kind of lowers the sea level on the the eastern seaboard of the United States to the eastern coast of North America has lower sea levels because of the strength of this current. If this current stopped, that would actually cause a greater increase in sea level than is seen in other parts of the world on the eastern seaboard. And if you think about it, the northeastern United States, especially near the coast, has a lot of major cities with a lot of people living there. So a lot of people would be displaced by those rising sea levels. And there is some evidence that there is slowing of the AMOC. Soil can also be affected by climate change. So, climate change is going to cause changes in not only temperature, but it will impact rainfall. In some areas, there will be less rain than usual and drought conditions. In other areas, there will be more rain than usual and flooding conditions. And that can do a few things like increase erosion, and it can also affect soil's viability or its fertility. So, drought can reduce soil moisture. It'll cause topsoil to be drier and can lead to desertification. This is where areas become desert. So, areas that used to be, say, grassland or even forested areas, though that's a little less likely than grassland, end up becoming desert. And they're no longer able to support the same types of producers that they were. And once desertification starts, it's kind of a positive feedback loop, so it'll just keep getting worse and worse and worse. Um, and so, also, if you have more frequent extreme weather events and you have more flooding, that can also, these heavy downpours with heavy rainfall that happen, can increase topsoil erosion. And then there's this kind of paradoxical effect where increased rainfall can decrease how much water infiltrates deeper into soil. This can happen because the large pore spaces that let water sink down into the soil can get filled by thickened plant roots, and that causes less water to go into like underground water, groundwater sources, and more of it will run off. Increased runoff can also cause increased erosion. And then rising sea levels can cause what's called saltwater intrusion, where the saltier water from the sea starts moving inland through the groundwater supply, especially if we start pumping out more of that groundwater for our use. And so that can leave the soil extra salty, and increasing soil salinity makes it less fertile. Remember, I've talked about back in the day, if you really hated somebody, you would salt the earth and nothing would grow there. Now, we've got a special section for how climate change impacts polar regions because the impacts are just more dramatic there. So, one thing is the warming that's being seen in especially the Arctic regions and western part of Antarctica are anywhere from 2 to 4 times faster than the warming being seen in equatorial regions. So, this graph is showing in like 2008 to 2009 what the temperature anomaly was, what's the increase in temperature. And you'll notice the redder areas are up here closer to the poles, as well as here in western Antarctica. They're experiencing a greater increases in temperature. Mostly, this is due to some positive feedback loops caused by two things: melting sea ice and ice sheets, and melting permafrost, each of which we're going to talk about in more detail. But first, I want to talk about something called albedo. Albedo is how reflective a surface is. So if a surface has high albedo, it reflects a lot of light and or heat. So high albedo surfaces are going to reflect most of the light or heat that hits them. They tend to be lighter colored. If you remember from, elementary school, if you're outside in the summer, you want to wear white colored clothes because they'll reflect the most light and heat and absorb less of it. Snow and ice have very high albedos, and so they will reflect more heat back into the atmosphere. Lower albedo substances are going to absorb more light and or heat. That's also why in the heat of summer you don't want to be outside wearing all black clothing because it will absorb more heat. So things like asphalt, dark, especially rich black soil, or any darkly colored items are going to have a low albedo and they're going to increase the absorption of heat. This is important because if you think about the polar ice caps, they actually do a lot to reflect a lot of sunlight. They reflect about 90% of the light that hits them because of all that ice and snow, which has a very high albedo. When that ice and snow melt, that means less solar energy is radiated into space. Instead, you now have open water, and open water has a low albedo. Open water is going to absorb a lot more heat and light than ice. And so that is going to increase the temperature in the area, which is then going to increase the melting of sea ice and ice sheets, which is then going to, you know, decrease the albedo of the region, which is going to mean more heat absorption. And this positive feedback loop just keeps going and going. So once you start melting sea ice, then that's just going to keep making the problem worse. Something similar happens when you thaw out permafrost. So the tundra has this layer of permanently frozen soil, and it covers about a quarter of the land in the northern hemisphere. So a large part of the surface of the northern hemisphere is covered in permafrost. Well, unfortunately, as temperatures rise, that permafrost warms up. And as it melts, there's some organic matter that was trapped in the permafrost and it starts to decompose. That, especially since there's not as much oxygen in there, is going to cause methane to be released. And remember, methane has a higher global warming potential than CO2. So, kilogram for kilogram, you release a kilogram of methane, that's like releasing 25 kilograms of CO2 into the air. So then the methane is released into the air. Methane is a greenhouse gas, which then accelerates global warming and absorbs more heat, which then raises surface temperatures, which makes the permafrost melt even more, which releases even more methane, which is going to then absorb more heat. And this is also another positive feedback loop that's just going to keep making the problem worse. So, what are some of the consequences? Yes, I picked a lot of very sad pictures. There are plenty of species that depend on ice for their habitat and their food. Remember, in the Arctic, there is nothing under that ice except for ocean. And so, if the sea ice melts, it's not like polar bears or seals or Arctic foxes or walruses can just use the land underneath to do what they were doing on the sea ice. There's just open water. So, seals and walruses use ice to give birth as well as to rest. If that ice is not there, then their pups will be more vulnerable if they're having to give birth on land. Polar bears use their ice also to give birth to their pups and also for hunting. Arctic foxes, whales, caribou, and some other animals, other mammals use the ice for their foraging for them to be able to eat. And so when the ice melts, these ice dependent species have less habitat, and that is going to push them towards extinction. So that is it. After this, we're going to talk about effects on the ocean, and hopefully, these lessons will come a little faster.